Hi, it's Joe Mark Witt from Personality Hacker, coming to you from Orlando, Florida, where Antonio and myself just wrapped up a 5-day live profiler training event. We had students from all over come in and learn the art of conversational profiling. Right now, we're in part 2 of a 4-part video series. We want to show you some highlights from the main stage at the event we just finished. In the last video, we talked about some of the easy mistakes profilers make when they're first starting out in profiler training or when they're just starting out in their profiling experience. In this video, we want to talk about what to listen for in a profiling session, because you're listening for certain cognitive functions that the person you're interviewing or talking with is showcasing what they're talking about. But it's not always obvious which ones are their dominant or driver co-pilot cognitive functions. So you're listening for the nuances. Sometimes the cognitive function that shows up for us isn't the one that's the loudest. We're going to explain more in the video that we're going to shoot into right now. We're going to go on to the next part about what to observe when you're talking with someone in a profiling session. Just because something is obvious to you, this is nuance, but just because something's obvious to you in a profiling session does not necessarily mean that's the driver or dominant cognitive function that person is using. It will show up, the driver will show up, you will see it, it will be prominent in the experience, but there might be a lot louder voices coming from the person's personality. You might see other things come out than just the dominant or driver.
Right. Okay, so what does that mean? So you're seeing a function and it's very obvious. Oftentimes in profiling sessions, we think that just identifying specific cognitive functions is really what we need to be doing. But as Joel mentions, the tough part can sometimes be seeing a function and knowing you're seeing that function, but then where in their function stack does it fit, right? We're in the car model. And just like Joel was saying, the most loud one might not be the dominant or driver, and this trips people up all the time. This is why people think that they are a personality type that is their tertiary or 10-year-old function. They believe that function is actually their dominant or driver. It happens all the time. INFJs think they're INTPs. I can think of like a million examples. Sometimes INTPs think they're ISTJs. So once you've identified the specific function, now you've got to put it in the stack. You've got to put it in the car model. So there's certain characteristics that you're going to hear over time. Now remember, these are trends, they're not rules, all right? So there's nothing that's a silver bullet, there's no pattern that is always gonna play out. But for the most part, most people's functions show up in a way that kind of fits these dynamics. So the driver function is going to be, just like Joel, I think you use the word pervasive. I think that's great. It's going to kind of feel ubiquitous. It's going to feel all over the profiling session.
I'd say presumptive too would be a good word.
Yeah, because there's like there's a shrug quality. Our driver or dominant function is it's the thing that when we talk about how we all overvalue our own perspective, we all overvalue our own way of going through the world. It's primarily through this driver. This driver process it's very much overvaluing itself. And so it's hard to think that other people aren't seeing the same thing that you're seeing. And so when somebody talks about their dominant driver function, there's a quality of like, well, yeah, isn't that how it works? So there's no trying to convince you of anything. There's no like, this is how I go through the world. It's like, yeah, that's how you go through the world, right? That's how people go through the world. But it's going to be all over the place. Whereas the co-pilot or auxiliary function it's because it's a growth position for us generally, it's going to show up. It's not going to show up nearly as often as the driver usually. Sometimes it does, every once in a while, but very rarely. It's not going to show up as much, but when they talk about this function, they're going to talk about it with fondness. Almost like, yeah, every time I do that, that's the thing I know I'm supposed to be doing, right? Like I don't always do it, but when I do it, yeah, that's what I should have done. And so there'll be almost like a fondness for it. Not all the time. There are some types that sometimes create an antagonistic, or not types, excuse me, individuals that will create an antagonistic relationship with their auxiliary function. But that's not as common, and it's usually because they're using it almost like a one-trick pony. But if they have any real like skill with it, It's usually like, yeah, that's what I'm supposed to do. And talking to an INP, they're like, yeah, I went and visited some country and that, you know, like I had a great time and I learned a lot about myself and that's exactly what I was supposed to be doing. The real kicker is the 10-year-old or the tertiary function. And the reason why this one is difficult to manage is because we like this part of who we are. We sometimes over rely on this part of who we are, but there's still some insecurity and we can't get it out of us. So there's almost an overcompensating nature about this function. Like there's this almost like a dog and pony show, right? It's like da 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 da. This is the tertiary function that I'm using. So the thing that can,
and we all do this, by the way. Like all of us have like an overrepresentation of this. We tend to like want to showcase it. I mean, both of us do it. Like everybody does this.
Yeah.
This is a 10-year-old tertiary thing. It just showcases like this.
Right. And so the thing that can really trip you up in a session is trying not to let the loudness and the overcompensating nature of this function convince you that it must be their dominant or driver. Because the dominant driver, it's not, I mean, this 10-year-old or tertiary can almost be like a yapping dog, right? It's just yapping at you. And when you stop paying attention to the yapping dog, what you'll see like the dominant function like laying everywhere on the ground. Like if you're trying to walk through it, you wouldn't be able to step over it, right? It's everywhere, but it's quiet. It's just there. Whereas the 10-year-old or tertiary can be this yapping dog that takes all of this attention and you go, oh, the yapping dog must be really, really significant. It must be much higher in the stack. So it's important to create that distinction. Now, once you do a few profiling sessions and get them under your belt, you're going to really see this play out. But this is something to keep your finger on the pulse of. And then finally, the inferior or the 3-year-old function, that will show up. I mean, sometimes it'll show up in the flow question. That's the weird thing. You're going to see this come up in really odd moments throughout the entire session. But it's going to be something that the person has a bit of a push away relationship with. It'll be peppered in there. When you ask questions about it, they'll go, yeah, okay, maybe. But if you ask a direct question about this, it might be jarring almost. I know of a profiling session that was done on an ESFP, and the question was, what do you see yourself doing in 20 years from now? And it was almost like, ugh, I don't want to think about that. It was like this real push away energy from it. And so when you have a really solid, good, direct question to get what you think somebody's inferior is, if you're like testing that, when that happens, the reaction can sometimes give you a lot of clues about what position it falls in the CAR model.
So we're going to work on this afternoon a little bit of those questions. We have some starter questions in profiler training, but what we want to do is we also, because you're the instrument as the profiler, in a little bit later this afternoon, we're going to workshop what some of those questions can be and some of the nuances of when you're seeing the dominant or driver, the co-pilot, the 10-year-old, or that inferior, like when you ask those questions, what is that energy you're reading, or what are you seeing show up there? So we're going to do a little bit of that later.
Okay, so you just saw us workshop some of the nuances and distinctions around what to listen for to hear which cognitive function someone's talking about in a profiling session. This is a little bit of a taste of what these live events are like. We can't show you everything, but we're trying to give you snippets, some tastes of what it might be like for you to come to a live profiler training event. In the next video, we want to highlight what we call the flow question. The flow question is an open-ended question that gets a lot of information. It mines a lot of data from someone in a profiling session, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in the next video. So stay tuned.